Hello and welcome to the Daily Signal. Let's see what the Conservatives are up to today. Rather infamously, lately the Conservatives have been up to some bullshit. Senator Pat Toomey, a pencil-necked little dweeb from Pennsylvania, has decided that it would be super cool to stop legislation that would help American soldiers exposed to toxins from burn pits in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, full disclosure, I have a little bit of skin in this game. I am a veteran. I deployed to Afghanistan twice. I was not exposed to burn pit fumes. I'm very lucky. But, I have friends, and I use the VA for a variety of things, and it is my personal opinion that healthcare is good, and that if you send people to war, you should give them healthcare forever. It is also, for the record, my opinion that everyone deserves healthcare. We live in probably the wealthiest society by GDP in the history of the world, and yet refuse to pay for basic needs of the people who make it work. So, just as you watch this video, please do keep in mind that when I talk about how veterans deserve health care, I'm not saying that veterans are the only people who deserve it. I think that's very important, but I do think veterans deserve it. I think that if you break someone by sending them overseas, you ought to fix them. So this might be kind of an angry video, because today's Daily Signal is why Senator Pat Toomey did the right thing in stopping the burn pit bill. So, this article is written by Frederico Bartels, a policy analyst for the defense budgeting at the Heritage Foundation's Davis Institute from Who the Fuck Cares. This is what Frederico Bartels looks like. He did not join the military. He went to school, and then graduate school, and then worked at the Heritage Foundation as an intern, and now works for them as a contributor. Now, as we go through this article, I just think we should all keep in mind what this guy looks like. I want you to picture what follows as coming from this guy, because that's what it comes from. This guy, with that smirk, is going to write the article that we're about to read. Let's get to it. Senator Pat Toomey, Republican Pennsylvania, was right last week to stop legislation that would have presumed a host of health conditions are linked to American service members' exposure to burn pits. First, Toomey was right because the automatic presumption that many illnesses suffered by veterans are connected to burn pit exposure, ranging from chronic sinusitis to melanoma and any type of reproductive cancer, represents a failure of science. Further, the bill would have allowed the Secretary of Veterans Affairs to expand that list in the future. Okay, great start right off the bat. First, and this is not the biggest deal in the world, but I would just like to point out that every article in the Daily Signal reads like it was written by a sixth grader who just learned the rote way to write an essay. First, second, finally, in conclusion, Jesus Christ. So, a failure of science is an interesting term, especially given our last Daily Signal video, which was about how Dennis Prager believes that scientists are not scientific any longer, and only Prager and his preconceived notions are scientific. You can already kind of see where this is going, and how unscientific this take is, in that this guy is worried that the bill would not allow the Secretary of Veterans Affairs to expand the list of symptoms caused by burn pit exposure in the future. One of the things about science is that it's always discovering new stuff, and it seems to me that if it comes to light that burn pits cause other ailments, it would be good to expand the list to encompass that. And there are very few reasons that aren't awful that you would disagree with that. So let's continue. As the Government Accountability Office has stated, the effects from exposing individual burn pit emissions was not well understood, and the Department of Defense, DoD, has not fully assessed the health risks associated with the use of burn pits. Burn pits are shallow excavations or surface features used for open-air burning, a process used to dispose of waste during America's recent military campaigns in the Middle East. Although it may seem primitive compared to waste disposal methods used in the United States, this is a relatively common technique in the Middle East and elsewhere. Are we using Middle Eastern health standards now? It seems to me possibly we shouldn't be looking towards countries without robust systems to deal with trash as a way to deal with our trash. What's more, when looking at the vast number of service members who deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan, the percentage who actually were close to burn pits is relatively small. For those reasons, exposure to a burn pit cannot be considered part of the universal experience of service members who were deployed to the region. So it's worth noting that noted scientist Frederico Bartels, Master of Arts from George Washington University, devotes exactly one short paragraph to discussing the science behind whether or not burn pits cause damage to soldiers. So it is absolutely true that the Department of Defense is denying that burn pit exposures have serious long-term health effects in much the same way that they denied that Agent Orange had long-term side effects until the 90s. So I did a little bit of Googling on burn pit exposure to see what the science says. In an article entitled New Onset Asthma Among Soldiers Serving in Iraq and Afghanistan, points out that soldiers cannot have asthma to enter the militaries. What this study found was that Afghanistan and Iraq war veterans are significantly more likely to develop asthma than soldiers who did not deploy to those areas. 13% of U.S. Army medic visits in Iraq are for new onset acute respiratory illness. That would be a little bit over 1 in 10 soldiers who have a medical problem in Iraq have a problem with breathing. Increasing prevalence of chronic lung disease in veterans of the war in Iraq and Afghanistan found that there is a correlation between deployment and chronic lung disease, and also asthma. A 2011 study of air quality on Bagram Airfield in Afghanistan, where I visited several times, found the presence of chemicals in the air that increase risks of pulmonary disease, asthma, atherosclerosis, and other cardiopulmonary diseases. That would be diseases that affect the hearts and lungs. Those are two organs that are pretty important for quality of life and also quantity of life you do need them to live. An article entitled Post-Deployment Respiratory Healthcare Encounters Following Deployment to Kabul, Afghanistan, a retrospective cohort study, found that, quote, deployment to Kabul is associated with an elevated risk of post-deployment respiratory systems and new onset asthma. But if you really want to read an excellent distillation of the research into this and some very disturbing personal stories of soldiers who suffer due to burn pits, I would advise you to check out Jennifer Percy's The Thing They Burned, a truly outstanding article in the New Republic. I'm going to read some excerpts from this article to you now. Everything, all the trash of the war, was thrown into a burn pit, soaked with jet fuel and torched. There were hundreds of open-air garbage dumps spread out across Afghanistan and Iraq, right next to encampments where American soldiers lived and worked, ate and slept. The pits burned day and night, many of them around the clock, 7 days a week. Much of the waste in the pits was toxic, and burning it released a lethal array of pollutants, particulate matter, volatile organic compounds, hydrocarbons, neurotoxins. JP-8, the jet fuel often used to ignite trash, released clouds of benzene, a known carcinogen. One analysis conducted on dust sample from Camp Victory in Iraq found hazardous levels of copper, iron, and titanium particles. Other researchers detected dioxin, the cancer-causing chemical found in Agent Orange. Ash spread over everything. Leon Russell Keith, a military contractor who was stationed at Balad, testified at a Senate hearing in 2009. Our beds, our clothing, the floor. Thick black smoke poured into the barracks. The air conditioners blew ash. Ash stained the bed sheets. Their teeth turned black from the soot. Ash rained down on the men, on the American troops, the Iraqi detainees, the Iraqi correctional officers. These burn pits were supposed to be temporary, an imperfect stopgap required by the exigency of the invasion and occupation. But like much of the war, the burn pits were privatized, the military's trash turned into a lucrative for-profit enterprise. It did not take long for soldiers to begin to fall ill. As early as 2004, veterans who had served near burn pits began complaining of a complex and enigmatic constellation of symptoms: asthma, sinusitis, bronchitis, unexplained diarrhea, persistent runny nose or cough, severe headaches and abdominal pain, ulcers, weeping lesions on the extremities, chronic infections. Many coughed up black mucus, which they called plume crud, black goop, or Iraqi crud. Some developed cancers. Tumors grew on their lungs, brains, bones, and skin, including leukemia. Others suffered from severe respiratory conditions. What is happening with the burn pits follows an all too familiar pattern of official dishonesty and deception that has been repeated in war after war. First comes denial. The VA didn't acknowledge the damage caused by Agent Orange until 1991, nearly 2 decades after combat troops withdrew from Vietnam, and for years it dismissed the neurological condition known as Gulf War Syndrome as psychosomatic. Then, once veterans began to protest, the military agrees to study the problem. Next, it stalls for as long as possible. Long-term studies are commissioned, some of which can take decades. And finally, the government manipulates the outcome to reach the desired conclusion, that there isn't enough data to confirm a correlation between the illness and its apparent source. Again and again, from Saigon to Kabul, the government has designed inadequate studies, manipulated data, and ignored relevant academic research, all to avoid responsibility for the harm done to our soldiers. Their illnesses linger and worsen. For some ailing veterans, the delay effectively serves as a death sentence. Now look, I'm not going to read the entire article to you, although I really, really want to. All I can say is I would advise you to go ahead and read it. You can go ahead and read about how the VA and the Department of Defense are basically manipulating studies to make it look like this isn't a problem, when it absolutely is. So, with all that being said, let's return to Frederico Bartels and once again read the single paragraph in his article that discusses the medical effects of burn pits.
As the Government Accountability Office has stated, the effects from exposing individuals to burn pit emissions were not well understood, and the Department of Defense has not fully assessed the health risks associated with the use of burn pits.
Let's continue. So we have now concluded the scientific portion of this article, and yet the article continues. Let's get into the philosophical elements. Why is it bad to help veterans with medical problems? Although veterans who have served our country deserve our thanks and respect, that doesn't mean that treatment for every illness they suffer following their military service is the responsibility of the federal government. It absolutely does mean that, you little shit. As stated earlier, everyone deserves health care. Nobody in a society with the kind of wealth that we do should have to die of untreated illnesses or die as in horrible debt because they couldn't afford to pay for the treatment that saved their actual life. But veterans who signed up to go fight in your stupid, dumb wars do deserve medical care. Forever. Conservatives really enjoy talking about the selfless sacrifices that veterans make and how brave they are and how much they should be respected. And the troops get touted out a lot when people do things like, I don't know, protest American police brutality by kneeling before the flag, or talk about how wars are maybe not a good idea, or talk about how maybe we should help anybody in the world with any kind of social program. The veterans get trotted out. Why aren't we taking care of our brave heroes, our precious baby angels, the veterans? But you see, of course, that when the rubber hits the road, they don't want to take care of veterans. They don't want to. They want to minimize the amount that they can take care of them and then just leave them to fend for themselves. I mean, if the military didn't cause the illness, do they really deserve anything from us? Like, shouldn't they just suffer and die like the rest of us? It's sick, okay? It's sick. It's whatever. This guy is never going to have to worry about that. This guy works for the Heritage Foundation. All of his medical bills will be paid forever. He will never have to worry about whether the cancer of his lungs is caused by burn pits or something else. What he will do is write to his insurance, and that his insurance will pay for his treatments. You know, I don't know. Like, this is a very personal issue to me. Maybe you don't think that veterans deserve health care. I don't know. Maybe you think that only the very specific ways that the military broke veterans deserve any kind of attention. I happen to think that if you sign up to do a really, really shitty job and get promised health care, that you should get it. That's my opinion as a radical communist, I guess. That would be the radical communist opinion, that veterans deserve health care. Let's continue. Burn pit exposure is something that needs to be understood and researched, not simply presumed to be the cause of certain illnesses. Secondly, Toomey was right to stop the bill measure because, as worded, it would count resources associated with the measure as mandatory spending, a technical maneuver that would open the floodgates for even more government spending. Federal government spending mostly is divided into the categories of mandatory and discretionary spending. Discretionary spending accounts for about 1/4 to 1/3 of the federal budget, and it is what is debated and decided by Congress every single year. Mandatory spending, on the other hand, is not discussed annually, and, as a result, has grown uncontrollably. So let's go into what mandatory versus discretionary spending actually is. Discretionary spending is something that has to be renewed. It's an action must be taken to continue to spend it. So, for example, if discretionary spending was spent on roads, every year you would need to talk about whether the roads need more spending or not, whether they need more funding, and then you can adjust it as needed. Mandatory spending is spending that is locked in unless you actively take action to change it. So it is harder to change, but not impossible. It's not like you're signing some kind of blood oath to spend $400 billion forever. Basically, this would mean that we're going to spend $400 million on helping veterans with burn pit exposure unless somebody actively does something to stop that, unless someone actively makes a case that this is no longer a problem and we don't need to spend that money. So seems like that's not exactly the blood pact that Bartels is making it out to be. It just means that it's not subject to partisan bickering or being quietly cut from the budget next year because people decided to make a big show of helping veterans this year and then not doing that the year after, which is a thing that happens to veterans a lot. The legislation would have added yet another program to the mandatory spending pile. Congressional Budget Office estimates put the price tag of this bill at a minimum of $275 billion over a 10-year period, and that's a price tag that undoubtedly would grow unchecked over time. This increased government spending would be especially detrimental in the current economic climate of rising inflation and negative growth created by the Biden administration. Wow, a real fiscal conservative. This was certainly a very rare breed during the Trump era, but seems to have come back with a vengeance in the Biden administration. So let's see what noted fiscal conservative Frederico Bartels had to say about the defense budget 8 short days ago. The Biden administration had proposed a 2023 defense budget that would reduce the size of our armed forces, retire more ships and planes than it would buy, and ignore the impact of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. The Biden budget also massively underestimated the effect of inflation. The proposed budget asked for a 4.1% increase, but it was built on the assumption that inflation would only be 2.3%. But with inflation currently running rampant at over 9.1%, the proposed budget would have represented a net decrease. Oh, okay. Flash forward to present day, where newly minted deficit hawk Frederico Bartels continues this article. Why else should we not help veterans with their medical problems? Veterans are not a victim class that needs to be appeased by the government's throwing money at them. This legislation would treat them as victims who have been broken by serving their country and who need to be paid off to go away. And then one wonders why we have a recruitment crisis on our hands. Wow. So I'm gonna try really, really hard to discuss this in a way that doesn't involve me just shouting at the camera like a lot. Please pray for me in this difficult time. This paragraph does get to a very important conservative way of looking at the world. Jesus Christ, this is hard. I can't do it. Okay. We're gonna go through this sentence by sentence, clause by clause even. Veterans are not a victim class. So conservatives view any government program that involves money going from the government to people as a handout. So the capitalist idea of how things work is that if you work hard and save your money, then anyone can become prosperous. Anyone can lead a good and happy and rich life. We don't live in a society where that's true. People can work 80 hours a week at a minimum wage job and not be able to afford health insurance. That's a thing that can happen to you in this country. In order to reconcile the idea that capitalism allows anyone who works hard and is responsible to live a happy and decent life, and the fact that that is self-evidently not true when you look out at the world, is to assume that people who are not making it, people who are struggling, people who cannot afford things, are that way because they have somehow not worked hard enough and do not deserve it. There needs to be a reason for everyone who is poor to be poor that is moral. Because if they are a good and moral person who works hard and still poor, that would mean capitalism has some problems. And since capitalism is essentially a religion, that can't be true. And so there needs to be another explanation. So that is basically a linchpin of the conservative ideology, and it is why they oppose government programs so vehemently. Now, this same logic would lead you to believe that if veterans need help from the government, that is an implication that they are weak. And we can't have that, because veterans are our heroes. Veterans are strong. They're the people that we trot out when we're trying to tell other people to stop being so weak, stop crying about stuff. If we start treating veterans like people who have problems, then we have to apply that same capitalist logic to them and conclude that they're not actually very good or strong people after all, and we can't have that. And that is how you can arrive at a place where providing veterans basic health care for the things that happen to them overseas feels like calling them victims. This is exemplified by the very next sentence, which is this legislation would treat them as victims who have been broken by serving their country and who need to be paid off to go away. That second part, right? You're paying them off to go away. It seems like a really good way to make veterans go away is to not treat their health problems. They will go away if you do that. There will be fewer veterans complaining if you don't treat their illnesses. Paying them health care is paying them to stick around. You're paying so that they can keep living and have a good life. So that is one of the most sick and twisted sentences I've read in recent memory, and we live in a time when there sure are a lot of sick and twisted sentences being said by people. We have 2 paragraphs to go, and I haven't yet had a brain hemorrhage from absolutely freaking the hell out at how much I hate this guy. So let's see if we can get through the last 2 paragraphs without me exploding. We owe it to our veterans to treat them with respect and honesty. That starts by doing the hard work of actually studying and understanding the effects of exposure to burn pits. And it continues by making decisions that build conditions to help our country prosper and not be buried under a pile of debt. So anyone want to take any bets on whether Bartels here would like to sponsor studies to understand the effects of exposure to burn pits? I would bet all of my money that he would not support that because that would be fiscally irresponsible, as exemplified by the conclusion of that paragraph that basically says that the best way to help veterans is not to go into debt to help our country prosper. Because everyone knows that veterans are tools that America uses to make our country prosper. And it really is very unveteranly of them to ask for anything that might interfere or compromise their mission of sacrificing themselves for America. The rhetoric of sacrifice around veterans is very irritating to me as a veteran. We all like to talk about the sacrifices made by our troops, and one way that you could view that discussion is that it honors the people who make sacrifices. But another way that you could view it, and I think a better way to understand the state of America today, is that you are viewing the sacrifice as the point. The thing that soldiers do is sacrifice. Their job is to sacrifice, and they're happy to do it. That's why we glorify their sacrifice. The glory is the price that we pay them for their sacrifice. It is a reason why thank you for your service rubs a lot of veterans the wrong way, because it seems like you're paying us in gratitude rather than in health care. This happens a lot. If you get it into your head that the job of soldiers is to die bravely for their country, then veterans, first of all, have failed to do that very elementary thing. And secondly, in order to continue to serve their country, they need to continue to sacrifice in order to get prosperity for their countries. So it is very unveteranly and even unpatriotic to suggest interfering with veteran sacrifice in any way. Okay, one more paragraph. It's a summation, and then we're done. Toomey did the right, albeit unpopular, thing. For too long, veterans have been treated as a category to be paid off rather than as fellow Americans who contribute to building our country and its future. That last bit is an interesting pivot from what I was talking about, veterans as others to sacrifice themselves loyally. The idea now is that in order to assimilate veterans back into American society, we need to treat them as people who build society up and don't tear it down. They're not moochers and looters. They're not welfare queens. They're veterans, and it would be disgraceful to treat them otherwise. So that was the worst article that I've read this week. I hate it. I hate everything. That's it. So a big thank you to the patrons who make these videos possible. Could not do it without you. Appreciate you forever. A reminder to everyone that I am going to CPAC next week and that I will be returning, writing an article about it for the New Republic, and then hosting an AMA probably on Saturday, August 13th. If you would like to ask questions for that AMA, please hit me up. I've got links where you can do that in the description again. You can DM me on Twitter. You can comment in this YouTube video. I will see your comment. I will read the question. If you're a patron, your questions get read first, and your questions don't have to just be questions. You can do comments and concerns as well. Whatever you write, if it won't get me kicked off YouTube, I will read it. So I hope everyone keeps submitting questions, and I think that'll be really fun. So yeah, I'll see you on the other side of CPAC, and remember that if you really care about the troops, you will lead them to die rather than imply that they're weak and need assistance in any way possible. Everyone have just the best day.